Great. So there we go. The things I'm going to cover here are going to be the California Voting Rights Act, which, sounds like a big act having to do with everything about voting in California. It isn't. It's a very specific act. Districting versus redistricting. What is the Voting Rights Act? What is gerrymandering? Go over some criteria, and then the mechanics of how districting is done, and then go a little bit into the census data, and then finally cover the public hearing schedule. So the California Voting Rights Act is specifically a law that looks at cities, school districts, water districts, other agencies that have an election system that everybody in the jurisdiction votes for the members of that body. So an at-large system is anything other than a system where each elected member lives in a specific district and only the voters from that district vote to elect them. There are throughout the state kind of weird hybrid things, like some agencies that have districts, but everybody votes in them, or some agencies that have districts, but maybe there's 2 council members in one district or 2 water board members in one district. In Portland, they have a weird thing where some districts have 2, some districts have 3 members. All that stuff would be prohibited under the California Voting Rights Act if it could be found or it could be claimed essentially that there's racially polarized voting that is diluting the voting power of a protected class, of a minority population. And that's basically the recipe in the California Voting Rights Act is, are you in an at-large system? And if you have racially polarized voting, you have to convert to a system that is not at large and that is defined as being one where each council member is elected from a district and only by the voters in that district. So the California Voting Rights Act takes a lot of its principles from the Federal Voting Rights Act, but it makes those processes and criteria more loosely defined. A perfect example of this is that in federal law, you could also be sued and forced to go to districts. But in federal law, it would be a federal case. It would take years. It would be really expensive. And it would require that the plaintiff showed that you could draw majority minority districts, because that's really effectively only the only thing that the federal law will accept as needing a remedy, is the idea that districts are majority of one protected class, and specifically a majority of the voting population or eligible voter population of that one protected class. Under the state law, they kind of move around that, and they don't use the term majority minority. They use the term ability to influence. And in the court cases around this criteria, most recently a court case having to do with Santa Monica, the court found that California as a state had a right to create a looser interpretation of what's necessary to force this kind of change in election system, that the ability to influence could mean both the ability for a minority population to elect someone that they support, or the ability for the minority population to stymie the election of somebody that they don't support. Under the CVRA as well, unlike federal law, there's this written in guarantee that a plaintiff who sues will be able to get paid back. And there's actually essentially a schedule of payment for attorneys that bring these cases. This is very different than federal law. And in fact, I think that in the last 25 years or so, maybe one city was sued under the federal law, in part because it was so expensive to bring a claim under the federal law, and it took so long. The fees paid to attorneys can be restricted to what was originally $30,000, and now with adjusted inflation is something a little bit greater than that, if you follow a process that we'll discuss here tonight that is colloquially discussed as kind of the safe harbor provisions. So our firm is called Redistricting Partners. We will talk about redistricting and the rules of redistricting, but technically what we're doing is a districting because it's the first time. It's not a anything. So it's something that we'll just generally call redistricting. But Districting will do a couple things, and there's one thing it won't do. So it will determine who's eligible to run for office, meaning that you'll have to be a registered voter in the district that you want to run for when you fill out your paperwork to run for city council in future elections. And it changes who votes in that election. So only voters in that district will vote. So you'll have elections in which some parts of the city are having a November general election for city council, and other parts of the city aren't voting for city council at all. And the next election cycle, that will flip. Some things that it does not determine. It doesn't determine how you govern. And what I mean by that is that you can choose still to make decisions as a city council in the interest of the entire city. You can choose to budget for the entire city and not create kind of individual budgets for individual districts. Some cities do those things, like in Sacramento, maybe 15 years ago, I went in to meet with somebody, and on the door of their office, it said Council District 4 representing the communities of, and listed the communities almost as if saying, like, these are the communities that are the most important. Other cities don't treat it like that at all. They view their role when they're at the dais to think about the city as a whole, even though when it comes to an election, they're going to be focused on their individual district, obviously. So that is a decision you make about how you govern. There's nothing in the CVRA that requires you to govern in a different fashion. So redistricting and the districting process is essentially a process of trying to divide an area into equal populations for the purposes of representation. And we're trying to do two things at once. One is we're trying to ensure that when voters are represented, that they have the same equal representation as other voters. I did a redistricting for a community college district on the Central Coast one year, where we had one district that had 100,000 people in it and one district that had 12,000 people in it. They hadn't redistricted since the 1950s. And so that meant that in that equal representation, that if somebody wanted to go complain about an issue before this elected body, the people in the 100,000 person district would essentially have to take 8 people to go to the meeting to be equal in quote unquote representation as anybody who lives in the district that only had 12,000 people. Each of those 12,000 people's voice was louder because they had this unequal representation, a strength in the representation from being from a district that was 8 times smaller. The other principle that we're simultaneously trying to achieve is the idea of one person, one vote, meaning that when I vote, my vote for my legislative candidate or my congressional candidate or my school board or water district, that it's equal to everybody else that's voting in that election. When you have unequal district sizes and unequal voter populations, you have an inability to create that kind of equal representation and meet that one person, one vote. There will be a small technical thing that when we look at the data, you might draw districts that are perfectly equal in terms of population that we'll go over from the census, but find that some districts have more voters than others, but it's going to be more equal, and we try to balance both of those things. So the Voting Rights Act, the Federal Voting Rights Act, has 2 criteria that really affect elections and the ideas around disenfranchisement of racial minorities. The first is Section 2. Section 2 of the Federal Voting Rights Act has to do with the idea of majority-minority districts. Section 5 is no longer active, but you might hear people talk about Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. That was essentially a process that put the burden on the agency to prove that any election changes didn't have the effect of harming the minority population. There were 5 counties in California that used to be covered by Section 5. And in those cases, when we did redistricting, we would have to send the redistricting plans to the federal government for approval before they could be implemented. And so right now, the only thing that's operational is Section 2. And since I don't believe we will have a Section 2 district in the city, we'll obviously refer back to your attorneys when it comes to any questions around Section 2. But we won't be dealing, I don't think, with a Federal Voting Rights Act issue with regards to this process. The California Voting Rights Act, like I discussed, is something that will be operative and help drive our process. So just to cover it, what a Section 2 Voting Rights Act issue is when you have that idea of a majority-minority population, where that minority group is large enough to be more than 50%, and that minority group votes in a way that's cohesive, meaning that they kind of block vote or they vote for the same candidates or issues in concert with each other. And finally, where the white population votes against the interests of the minority population. So this involves a lot of study and analysis, and there are parts of the state where Section 2 is operative. And there are parts of the state where you have, significant racially polarized voting. But I don't think, like I said, you're going to have a Section 2 or Federal Voting Rights Act issue in the city of Los Altos. So we can pass through this real quick, because if we did have a concern, we would refer to your attorneys to help answer those questions. So whenever I tell somebody I work in redistricting, the first thing I hear is, oh, you mean you gerrymander? Like, they're synonymous terms. It's unfortunate, but that's what I think most people kind of gleaned from their, high school civics, was the idea that redistricting is gerrymandering. And obviously this is something that is, more than 200 years old, from a redistricting in which Governor Gary approved districts drawn by his state legislature that created a map that was kind of satirized in this cartoon. It wasn't even a map he supported. It was just one that he ended up signing. And, it has kind of defined, I think, a lot of what people think about redistricting. Now, the gerrymandering is kind of gone in a lot of what we try to do here in the state of California around the California Voting Rights Act and in the state redistricting process. But it wasn't long ago that you saw a district like this one right here that actually looks a lot like the original gerrymander to me, and there were a lot of examples of this, districts that were drawn to, favor a candidate or favor some kind of a political outcome, or drawn essentially in a way where the true purpose of the plan was never made public, was never understood by the voters, but was understood only behind closed doors to people who had political motives. And so we're not going to be having any gerrymandering in this process. The state law requires transparency. It requires us to utilize criteria and a process that will ensure we don't have a gerrymander. Gerrymandering, though, does work in the sense of, if you were to look at other states around the country where they take a population that is not as strong in its representation, but then through the drawing of districts, they artificially strengthen it. And this is an example from kind of a first grad school kind of example of how gerrymandering works. And that is that if I were to give, each of you these 9 triangles and say, draw it in 3 sets, most of you are just going to do something like this. And if you did them horizontal or vertical, you'd get essentially the same thing, where the yellow triangles represent the majority of 2 districts and the green the majority of 1. And essentially the yellow there are more yellow triangles, and the yellow would represent 2 of the 3 districts. But if you were to give the pen to somebody who is maybe looking at it from a more strategic standpoint, they could draw something like this, where now you have the group that has the largest representation actually having the fewest number of representatives. And we see that around the state. It's not around the country. It's not just one political party that does this. Both political parties do it. But, it is something that really is prevalent in a number of states in their statewide and even in their local redistricting process. So the other thing about gerrymanders is that people think of gerrymanders as only being partisan, that we're drawing districts for the purposes of a political outcome. So, whether you're talking about North Carolina or, some of these states with real egregious gerrymanders, you're talking about political outcomes generally. But in addition to partisan gerrymandering, there's also something that's known as racial gerrymandering, where you're drawing districts to discriminate against a minority population. And, as an example, they would do these things in the South post Reconstruction, where you would have the Black population in the middle of an area, and they'd say, oh, okay, that's a great, community there. Let's draw our 7 districts so they each have a small piece of that area, ensuring that you have, 7 or 9 or 12 districts, all of which have split up that Black population in a way where now that Black population can never elect a candidate from their community, because the voters that are really deciding the election are those voters that are in the majority. And then there's also a thing called incumbent gerrymandering, where you would see this. Literally, we've seen some of this in California, where there was a district that came down the 5, then went across for one census block, and then went down the rest of the 5. And that was to draw a school board member into a district. And you saw this all around the state, and it was very common in local redistricting, and obviously very common in statewide redistricting, especially with legislative districts where you have to live in the district. In congressional, you don't. But incumbent gerrymandering was outlawed in the state redistricting process with the creation of the commission, and it has been effectively prohibited in the local government process through the Fair Maps Act, that has rank criteria. And the only place where it mentions incumbents in the rank criteria is to say you can't consider incumbents. So what are the criteria? I've said this word half dozen times already, and I'm just going to kind of go through what this criteria is. The first criteria in redistricting is that districts are equally sized. And that means not geography, not voters, not eligible voters, but actual people based in the most recent decennial census. So it is the total number from the 2020 census. And we would use that number not only now, but we would use that even if we were redistricting in, 3 or 4 years up until 2031. They're going to continue to use the 2020 census to create districts that are of equal size. So there's a lot of case law on this around what equal means. In California, we've actually codified a 10% buffer, essentially, for the largest district being 10% larger than the smallest district. In some states, they'll say 5% over, 5% under, which is 10%. But in California, it's even more flexibility, because you could have a situation where one of your districts is 8% over and the other districts are all 2% under, and that combines to be a total deviation of 10%. So you have a 10% buffer from the largest to the smallest district. And like I said, this is based on total population on people for the purposes of determining what is equal. Contiguous. This means whole pieces. And when you're drawing districts, believe it or not, there have been some districts that would kind of show up in one part of a agency and then pop up somewhere else. But districts have to be whole units. And then there's another term within redistricting that we refer to functionally contiguous. And what I mean by that is that, if from a satellite photo, something looks contiguous, but it's split by a railroad track, and there's a, Camp Pendleton Navy base is in between the two sides of it, and there's a mountain there, and there's a stream there. It could be contiguous, like looking on a map or looking from a satellite photo. But in terms of functionally, the two populations on either side of both of those barriers are functionally not contiguous with each other, because they don't really get to one side to the other without going outside of the district. So functional contiguous is an issue that we'll deal with. There are agencies, even cities, that have non-contiguous parts. And the idea with a non-contiguous part, like if you have what we call an island, that is some area outside or not connected to your city boundary that is technically part of your city, then it would be in the most nearby or adjacent population. And then, in fact, with actual islands, like Treasure Island, how it's drawn into a district is to be drawn into the most nearby, functionally contiguous area, like maybe where a ferry goes to. This is an example of a city in a districting plan that was drawn actually in your area. where there was an issue around contiguity. And if you were to look at this purple district, in the middle of the purple district is this one little chunk that is connected only to the blue area. And it is essentially and then this third one is not connected at all to either of those first two. This is a district that is not contiguous, even though there would have been options to draw these maps in a way that was fully contiguous. Now, this, again, is the idea of functionally contiguous, where this is the city of Davis. So if you were to drive to Sacramento, you would drive right along this yellow highlighted area. And somebody came forward in this redistricting and said, why don't we just draw 5 columns? The problem was that if you were to drive 5 columns, you would have this purple area, which is south of the 80, that's bisected by the 80 and by a railroad track. You would have that area be literally, or, from a map, contiguous, but functionally not contiguous, because you'd have to have people being on either side, literally, of the tracks in the same district. So this districts were drawn in a way that preserved that functional contiguity by making sure that South Davis was all in one district together. Communities of interest, and this could be an entirely whole presentation. In fact, when we talk with the community and do public engagement, we do spend a lot of time talking about communities of interest. So communities of interest in the redistricting process, this is a subjective term. It is, what does it mean to me or to somebody who's coming forward? What does it mean to you as council members? Because while we have examples, even examples that might be raised around Voting Rights Act communities as a community of interest, there are so many other things that can be considered a community of interest. And while racial groups can be considered a community of interest, and we can talk about and we'll look at data on the racial composition of districts, it cannot be the predominant factor. So as an example, we will not be saying, can we put more Latinos in that district? We will not be saying, I only want a district that is X% Latino or Asian or African American or Chaldean or Armenian. We're going to be talking about them as communities of interest, but not doing something where it reinforces some idea that there's a preset plan to hit a certain number or to draw a district that is no other criteria other than maximizing its racial composition. Before I leave the discussion communities of interest, I want to give some examples of communities of interest. We work all around the state, and oftentimes within a city, you might find communities of interest that are defined by physical location, either sides of the tracks, either side of El Camino Boulevard, either side of a BART station. It could be defined by people who live in an area that's higher income or lower income. It could be defined by people who live in an area where there's more seniors or more young people. All of these things can be communities of interest. The 3 things we want to look for in a community of interest are A, that it's a geographically definable community. And what do I mean by that? I mean, you can say, oh, the people who really are focused on preserving the outdoors live in this area that has a lot more open space. So it's geographically definable. If you were to come forward and say, well, we're all left-handed and, we have special questions about, this process and we want to be a community of interest because we're all left-handed, unless, unbeknownst to me, you've moved all your left-handed people to one side of the city, there's no geographic representation of that community of interest, so it wouldn't qualify. The second is that they have issues before the city council where you're actually doing policy that affects them. Young people, you might not think of young people as a community of interest, but my first political action I ever took was when I was in my teens and I went to the city council because they were going to ban skateboarding on the sidewalks, and they weren't going to vote for a skate park. And this was, I don't want to say how many decades ago, but it was a long time ago. And you could, as an example, have community that is arguing for something that is, a facility or access or a policy that affects them uniquely, that could be considered a community of interest. So we want to see things that have kind of a nexus to some kind of a policy. And the third thing, really when we're talking about this idea of these communities of interest, we want to have, the geographic area, the connection to the policy, and an idea of being able to map and have data on these things. So if somebody comes forward and they say, I'm a community of interest, it really empowers them to be able to show where they are. Census data can show where they are. A map of showing the roads that define them can show where they are. So all of those things help in our ability to, utilize that information. Sometimes in this presentation, we have a lot of examples of different communities of interest, but since I didn't see that slide, I just wanted to make sure I discussed that. So easily identifiable and understandable following natural man-made boundaries. This is kind of the same thing as what I was talking about earlier with communities of interest, with the added criteria that when these maps are drawn, you want them to kind of look to residents like, oh, that makes sense. Like, oh, that's my community. And you're going to get that kind of feedback from the public. And as we're drawing lines, we're going to try to draw the lines in a way that represent how people kind of already see themselves, what neighborhoods they're in, and that those things are preserved. Keeping districts compact. Again, compactness is a criteria that, means something specific in the state law around redistricting. And around the country, they have different measures of compactness and what means compactness. There's a bunch of mathematical formulas. There's, criteria that are just kind of like eyeball tests, like outlining funny shapes. And there's, a whole host of different research that's been done around what makes a compact district. But in California, we look at a criteria that says a district's compact if it doesn't bypass a nearby population to go get a further away population. And that's kind of a word salad, but what it essentially means is that if I'm drawing a district, and let's say my Zoom window is the city, and I'm starting over here drawing a district, and I go around this population here and around this population here to go all the way over here to make the other part of the district. So I make a district that goes like from here, and there's like a little sliver, and then all the way over here, and it pops up again. I've bypassed all of this population in one corner to get to something that's further away in another corner. And the idea with redistricting in California is more of this idea of keeping nearby populations with each other. And this is an example of a non-compact redistricting. This is the city of Martinez. So one that is kind of nearby. When you're going up towards the 80, you pass by Martinez. If you're going from the other side, I guess, from the Alameda side. And if you look at these districts, you can see these sinuous districts like District 3 that comes through. It takes a population that's a downtown population on the west side, and then basically follows the freeway to get to the other side in another distant, faraway population. And when you look at what the plan looks like now, they're redistricting in 2020, you can see those districts keep nearby populations near each other as opposed to connecting faraway populations. The map on the left was called a parody of the original gerrymander by a judge after it was drawn sometime in the mid 2015, 2016, maybe something like that in their CVRA conversion. But in 2020, when it was redrawn, I think it was the Mercury News wrote this was one of the best redistrictings they'd seen in the region. So the other criteria that are in the Fair Maps Act is that you're not considering the homes of incumbents or candidates. You're not drawing districts around the needs of one individual person. You're also not allowed to draw districts for the advantage or disadvantage of a political party. Those are kind of criteria conditions for the process. And then in terms of process criteria, you're looking at things like the minimum set of hearings, encouraging public engagement. And then also this presentation today, all of the materials, all of the maps we draw, all of the public hearings that we have need to be archived on the city's website for 10 years, at least until the next redistricting. So you're going to have this plan, as long as it's enacted, you're going to have all the information available to the public to see what was discussed, what wasn't discussed, what criteria were used, and what maps were considered. So that is a part of the public transparency that we have in this process. So I'm going to dive a little bit into the nerdier parts of the mechanics of redistricting. And redistricting really starts with the census data. Now, people think of the census and they say, oh yeah, I know what the census is. It's that once every 10 years thing. And that's, true. But the reality is that there's some layers in there that we need to kind of understand, so that when we're talking about the process or the maps or the data, that we're understanding kind of what are the component pieces, what are the ingredients that we're going to be using from the census, because the census actually produces a lot of products on ways of calculating populations and ways of looking at data for the country. So first off, the census data is actually two types of data. The first type of data is the physical areas of every census block group, the geography of the districts of the census. It's actually like lines, okay? That's one piece of the data. It's considered data, even though it's not numbers and digits. It's actually data in the geographic sense. The other kind of data that we have is the numbers. So you can think of, in one data set, it'll have a number 3, and then it defines in the other data set what little area that number 3 goes into. So the geographic data, think of that as like a honeycomb, and the data from the census is like the honey fitting into each of those little honeycombs, letting you understand that in this one little geographic shape, there's 27 people. In this little geographic shape, there's 3 people. Now, in the census that comes out every 10 years, the data in that honeycomb is exact. It's 3 people based on who was living there, April 1st, 2020. That's the number. We're going to stick with it. That's the exact number of how many people lived in that little part of the honeycomb or that little census block. And that's essentially what we call point in time data. That means at that point, this is the exact number. The other data we're going to see a lot of in this process isn't actually that specific. It'll say, okay, we have a survey, and we're using the American Community Survey is what it is. And we're using a sample from a survey that was given to 3.5% of the country's population every year. And over the last 5-year average, in this one census block group, there were 33 people who were adult citizens at that time. And so when we're looking at that 30 people, it'll say 15 of those were Latino, 3 of them were Asian, 2 were African American, and the remainder were white. That data is an estimate. It's not a point in time exact number. It's an estimate. It literally comes with a margin of error. And we have that data that we're going to be using in this process. It's going to be sometimes we're talking about data and it's very specific, the exact data. Other times we're talking about data and it is coming from an estimate that we use to calculate something like the citizen voting age population of an area. So the geography side, just to dive in a little bit more, it's these nested geographic areas. A block is really tiny. Maybe it's 3 people, maybe it's 0 people, maybe it's 20. A block group is a collection of blocks. So maybe there's 6 blocks in that block group. Maybe that block group has 115 people. Maybe it has 1,500 people. And then a tract is a collection of different block groups. And that might have 10,000 people or 5,000 people. And so you can see it's kind of like, these nested geographic areas that comprises the census geographies. And so that's going to come up when we're actually drawing lines, because we'll be able to see things like the block groups and the blocks in your city. And this is actually what they look like. Little teeny blocks. This looks a lot better. This is a lot easier. This is block groups. Now we've taken those. And then these are tracts, really big areas with lots of block groups and lots of blocks. And as you can see, these tracts are in the thousands of population. Whereas if you could see it, these blocks are really small populations, but they just get comprised into these larger pieces. Now, on the data side, the honey we put into that honeycomb, there's the decennial census data and the population as of April 1st, 2020, that determines the district size. Now, the one catch to this is that in the state of California and in a number of other states, we do a small adjustment that has to do with prison population. And so what that means is that any place like, say, Kern County that has a big prison population, they literally just yank that data straight out of those areas and they reallocate those prisoners to where they were living prior to their incarceration. So it is meant to make a more equitable redistricting. I'm happy to talk about that side of it, but for your purposes, just know we're going to be using a modified version of the census that it comes out of UC Berkeley that's required by state law for us to use, where you might have one of those census blocks that I say, and the census has 3 people, but UC Berkeley and this state is saying, actually, there's a 4th person there because there's somebody who lives in that census block who was incarcerated in 1997 and lives currently at a facility in Kern County somewhere, but we're going to just add 1 person to that census block. It won't make a significant difference in any redistricting in your area, but it does make a big difference in redistricting in areas that have actual facilities. And just so you know, it has to be certain types of facilities. So if there's a facility for veterans that is there, or a facility for people who are incarcerated for mental health issues, those aren't necessarily counted. So there's different kinds of facilities that count and don't count. The American Community Survey, like I discussed, is the survey portion of the data that we're going to use as opposed to the decennial census data. And the most important tool that we'll have from that data is called citizen voting age population. And that citizen voting age population is a proxy for eligible voters. And so when I say the citizen voting age population of this district is, 1,300 people, but 40% of them are Asian, that means that of the eligible voter population, 40% of them are Asian. That's the data we use for determining anything having to do with the ethnic composition in the Voting Rights Act context. So without further ado, this is the city boundaries for Los Altos. And we've constructed this based on what we got from the US Census and also looked at other data sources just to make sure that every little area is properly accounted for. We'll make sure throughout the process that, that this data is all correct. We do, as an example, have one little pocket in the middle of the city where there's no population, but it's an island. It's a unincorporated part of the county that is within the city boundaries, within its external boundaries, but isn't technically a part of the city. When we look at the data for the city, you'll see right here, we have just a citywide column with that first area, first top box is that 2020 census. So like I said before, this is the data that comes once every 10 years, and it is point in time data where the census is saying that it's 31,668 people who live in the city. That is different than if you went online and Googled population Los Altos. It would probably give you an estimate from a more recent city data set. But for what we do in redistricting, we're going to use this. And this is also the prison population adjusted data. So it might be 12 people more or 15 people more than what was in the original census data. The population within the city is roughly 5% Latino, roughly 35% Asian. Now, that data is inclusive of the total population, meaning all the kids, all the non-citizens, whereas the second data down at the bottom, this is coming from a different product. This is the American Community Survey. This is more updated than the 2020 data. It's based on a 5-year estimate, and it has your adult population at 20,000. Within that, you'll notice the Latino share has gone from 4.9 down to 4.2. And the Asian share has gone from 35.2 down to 28%. And so essentially what's happened there is that the Latino and Asian populations, as a share of their total population, total citizen voting age population, they're both lower, meaning that they either have more kids or more non-citizens in those populations than the white population. The African-American population actually increases a tiny bit. Now, one of the things that we see in data like this, especially when you get to small numbers, is weird things that make no sense. So I just want to point out something that's weird and makes no sense in your data. And that is that the census had 184 Black residents in the city based on the 2020 census, but magically there are 205 that are adult citizens based on the adjusted data, or this citizen voting age population data at the bottom. So these are both true at the same time. What's true is that as of April 1st, 2020, the census calculated 184 Black residents. And it's also true that a product that census puts out that works with averages and works with 5-year time spans and has a different methodology says that there are approximately 205 Black residents who are adult citizens in the city. So this will not have an impact on the redistricting, but it does kind of help us understand, like, oh, these are numbers that second data set is using a different methodology than the first data set. And somebody might come forward and say, well, the first data set's wrong because a lot of people honestly didn't want to take the census. And they might have some data to support that there were participation rates that were lower than people wanted in the US Census. And that's true. And somebody else might come forward and say, well, the other data is wrong because it's an estimate and so on. But the fact is, for our purposes, we have to treat this data like it is absolutely factual and real. Because if we are following the state law, we have to use the numbers from that top data set to determine the equal population. And if there was a lawsuit and a question was asked by a judge, what does the census say is the Latino voting age population, your attorneys would have to cite the number in the second table. So for our purposes, these data are what we are going to use in the redistricting process. And I just wanted to give you a wider discussion around these things because sometimes people do ask questions, and it's important for us to kind of understand a little bit more of the background. Now, the hearing part of this process, we have 3 hearings that are set right now.
Paul, yeah, I'm going to stop you because I think the schedule hasn't been fully determined yet.
Oh, well, then I will stop there. And I thank you for correcting me on that. And I think at this point, I'm happy to stop my screen share. I can bring up any one of those slides if somebody has a question, and then answer any other questions that you have.